We'll go ahead and get started, and anybody else who wants to trickle in and join us is certainly free to do so. Thanks for coming out to PixelPop. I appreciate your coming out instead of going to the New York Comic-Con, because I know that you had choices, and it's nice that you came to join us here today. So my name is Jamie Madigan, and I'm going to talk about video game psychology and game engagement. So I write, lecture, and podcast about the psychology of video games, mostly over at psychologygames.com. I also have a podcast called the Psychology of Games Podcast. It's not the best name, but it works pretty well for searching for and so forth. And then I also recently had a book come out called Getting Gamers, The Psychology of Video Games and Their Impact on the People Who Play Them. And I don't want to brag, but that book is available for pirating on the internet. Was kind of impressed when that happened. So I talk a lot about these different types of topics, and today I'm going to talk about 4 different broad topics about psychology and game engagement. I'm going to talk about like quest logs and tracking. I'm going to talk about competition, some of the psychology behind competition. I'm going to talk about the use of social information in games, how we compare ourselves to others, and how we evaluate our own performance. And then I'm going to talk about some of the psychology behind free-to-play pricing and some of the research that's been done about that. So for each one of these topics, I'm going to talk about a number of different sort of psychological phenomenon that are related to that, and some research that's looked at those phenomenon either within the context of video games sometimes, or in broader contexts such as consumer psychology or social psychology or other types of things, but how those concepts could be applied to video games. And then I'll give you some ideas if you're a game designer or you work in the game industry, or if you're a researcher, some ideas of things that you might experiment with on your own, some things to run some A/B tests on or play around with and do some focus group testing. So the first topic we're going to talk about related to the psychology of engagement is quests. On quest logs. So this is, a pretty ubiquitous game element. This is an example from Skyrim, I think. And, loading these types of quests and all this information is pretty standard for role-playing games and other types of games, but you also see this type of quest log, even if it's not called a quest log, show up in other games in the form of achievements and progression towards challenges or those types of things. So even if it's not called a quest log, you still see the same presentation of information. And most gamers would rather see a short quest log than a long one. I know it stresses me out to have like a ton of different side quests and things on my log that I want to complete, and I will rarely, want to leave an area in a game until I've checked as many of them off as I can. So we like to complete tasks once we start them, and I think we'll do very odd things, or at least they look odd to outsiders. We'll grind, we'll do the same thing over and over again. We'll, quick load and do challenges that are very difficult in order to just kind of try to pare down these quest logs or reach these achievements or complete progression towards a task. And I think some of the psychology around why we do that is really interesting. So for example, there's one phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect. And perhaps the apocryphal, but the story is that there was a Russian psychologist working in Germany named Bulma Zeigarnik back in like the 1940s, I think. And she and some colleagues were out at a cafe having lunch. And she noticed that the waiters who would bring the orders to the different tables would be able to remember everything about the orders that everybody at the table gave, and they would be able to get everything right. But then once they had delivered the food, the waiters couldn't remember anything else about the orders. If you went back to them even a few minutes later and said, what did this person order? They would have no idea, but they would be able to get the orders right for the first time, almost every time. So Zeigarnik went back to the lab and started doing some experiments where she would have subjects start like puzzles, like word puzzles or different types of tasks, and some of them she would let them finish the tasks, and some of them she would interrupt when they were about like partway through. And it found out that, the people who were not able to complete the tasks were able to recall more information even sometime later about like what they were doing and what the objectives were. But the people who were allowed to finish the puzzles pretty much completely, immediately forgot all about them. So the idea is that we remember more about incomplete or unfinished tasks than we do finished ones. They create sort of a mental tension that weighs on our mind and makes it easier to recall information about those tasks. So you see this in video games all the time, show up, I think, in the form of quest logs. And anybody who's trying to gather 14 Gore-Tusk livers to complete a quest in World of Warcraft is not going to leave Westfall when they have 12. They're going to want to complete that task and get sort of that mental release and release of that mental tension. It shows up in progress towards achievements, games that show you've completed this much of progress towards the achievement or the challenge. I think it shows up in the just one more turn types of games, like your Civilization games, where, okay, if I complete this turn, then I'll complete construction on this building, and that will let me do thing. But now I only got 2 more turns for this other thing. But now if I wait 1 more turn, then I'll have the unit trained for this. And it's always just sort of like one more thing that you complete each turn. And there's actually been some researchers who think that one of the most iconic video games of all time, Tetris, is the Zeigarnik effect incarnate, because you are literally completing rows at the bottom of the screen, and then those rows literally disappear from view once you finish it. So even if it's not the Zeigarnik effect in practice, it's a pretty good allegory for it as well. So we love checking side quests, and we love going on that information. And I think what's really interesting then is that you take this a little step further, and it's fascinating what game designers can do to sort of kickstart this type of phenomenon. The next thing I want to talk about is called the endowed progress effect. So you can imagine 2 people, let's call them like Kim and Carlos, and they have cars, and their cars are filthy. So they decide to go to a car wash. And the car wash that they go through, it's one of those automated ones, and the car wash is giving away those little punch cards where it's like, okay, if you get your car washed so many times, you get the next one for free. And let's say that Kim goes in and she gets a card, a frequent buyer card that requires 10 stamps to get a free wash. But the lady behind the counter is nice, and she says, here's 2 free starter stamps to get you started. So she's got a card, she's got to fill it up with 10 stamps, but she's got 2 to get her started. Carlos goes up and goes to the same place, and he also gets a punch card, but the lady is not quite as nice to him, but she gives him a card that requires 8 stamps, but she doesn't give him any free starter stamps. So you kind of easily see the idea is that both Kim and Carlos need 8 more stamps to get their free wash, right? But Kim got one that required 10, but she's 20% of the way towards that free goal. So who do you think it is that is going to be more likely to come back and get their free car wash ultimately? Is it going to be the one who got the 10 with the 2 free, or is it going to be the one that got the 8 with the none free? It's going to be Kim, who had a longer, more difficult goal, but sort of got progress towards it off the bat. And so the researchers actually did this experiment, exactly like I described, with a real car wash and a bunch of real subjects, where they gave them these 2 versions of the punch cards. And they found that indeed, people who were endowed with progress right off the bat for their goal waited less time to get their car wash. They came back more frequently, and a much higher percentage of them actually ended up completing their punch cards and paid for more washes overall. So I think you see this thing show up a lot in game design, or you could, where if you go in and if you're playing like a game and you rescue a couple of slaves in the wasteland, and they say, oh, there were 12 of us originally, you freed 2, go find the other 10, presenting that quest information that way relative to just saying, okay, there's 10 slaves out there in the wasteland waiting to be freed, go find them. Like the one in the situation where you get progress started towards that goal, that ultimate goal of 12, but you get 2 free off the bat, is much more likely to get players sort of engage with that goal and get them to pursue that goal and follow it. Another psychological phenomenon that this kind of folds into is something called reactance, or sometimes called psychological reactance. And I'll explain this diagram in a second. But the general idea is that people hate to lose choices once they feel like they have them, right? So once you feel like you have the ability to buy a product, for example, you sort of, even if you haven't bought it in a long time, you get annoyed when that product is taken off shelves, for example. And in video games, you see this where if you have the option to follow one narrative path, but that narrative path then gets locked off, people kind of get annoyed by that. It's just very fundamental psychological reality that once we feel like we have options, we hate losing the options. Kind of tied into a larger psychological construct called loss aversion. But this one happens to be about choices. And there was a really clever study that was done by a guy named Dan Ariely, who's a behavioral economist out at Duke University, where he set up this type of game. And he had people come in, and they sat down to play this game, and the idea was that they had like 100 mouse clicks or something like that. And they could click on one of 3 doors on the screen. So they could click on door 1, 2, or 3, and each one of the doors paid out a random amount of money. So door number 1 might pay randomly between, say, like 3 and 5 cents, door number 2 between 4 and 7, and then door number 3, 8 to 11 cents. And so the idea was that, this was real money that the subjects were going to get at the end of the experiment, and they, could spend all these clicks. So sort of like the totally rational thing to do would have been to find the door that paid the most money per click, right? And then just click, 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 and just spend all of your clicks on that, and don't worry about the other doors. And indeed, that's what they found out that people did. But then in another condition in the experiment, they threw in the trick that if you started to ignore the other doors by not clicking on them, they would start to shrink, and then they would go away entirely, and you wouldn't have the option of clicking on them anymore. So what they found then was that people would back out and, quote unquote, waste clicks on those lower paying doors because clicking on them sort of reset it, and they wouldn't go away for a while. So even though those doors paid out less money, people hated the idea of losing the option to click on them enough that they tended to kind of back out and waste clicks on those lower paying doors and as a result, get paid less at the end of the experiment. Totally irrational, but humans don't make rational decisions a lot of times. And so I think you find this sort of thing can show up in games or can be put into games, like I said, when you are looking at different branching storylines and one of them gets locked off because of a choice you make. It always makes you think of like BioWare RPGs, where you have the different options to like romance the different party members, but ultimately choosing to pursue that quest line, that romance quest line with one locks out the others, right? And if you try to kind of play the field and like keep all of them going along, eventually like the characters will come up to your character during camp at the night and say like, hey, what's it going to be? Which one of these paths are you going to go down? And then that will lock off the others. And when I play those games, I always do find myself kind of like just trying to string everybody along as long as I can, and then I'll create like a save file that I can come back to at a later date for another playthrough and see what those other types of things look like. But it just goes back to that basic idea that even if I wasn't interested in like following up on that character's storyline, that romance part of the storyline, I didn't like the idea of losing it. I didn't like the idea of locking it off. So this can show up all the time in different game design, and I think that sometimes it could be used for actually pretty good effect if you want to introduce some drama and some weight and some cost to the decisions people make. It's not necessarily a bad thing to make your players feel that sense of tension or that sense of loss if it can be used for narrative purposes. So generally speaking, some things to try: keep track of the decisions that players make. Make them aware of those decisions. Threaten to take options away when you want to make choices matter. Endow them with progress in ways that I described, different ways of framing what tasks or what quests that they're working on. Don't be afraid to force choices and make things interesting. Next topic, let's talk about competition. So competition's obviously tightly integrated to gaming in general. Most of the most popular games, your League of Legends, your Dota 2s, and other types of games, your Clash of Clans and Clash Royale, all have a very big element of competition to them, right? So people are competing and they're playing directly against each other. And even in single-player games nowadays, there's still some sort of forms of competition in the form of like comparing scores or leaderboards, being able to see other people's achievements, being able to show off your gear, being able to race against ghosts of other players, that type of thing. So competition is a pretty fundamental part of game design, and it shows up all the time. And there's been a lot of interesting research done on how we perceive information about competition and the way that different information can be framed to motivate us to compete more and to keep trying to improve and do all that sort of stuff. So let's take a look at a few different psychological phenomena related to that. First one is called the related attribute hypothesis. So this kind of goes back to the 1950s, I think. A famous psychologist named Leon Festinger came up with this theory called social comparison theory. And the idea is that as humans, we love information about how well we're doing, right? You know, do I have a good job? Do I have a nice house? Do I have, you know, do I make a lot of money? Is my PvP gear good? That kind of stuff. Like, we want information about how we're doing and how we're performing. And in the absence of meaningful objective information about that, you know, of a score, we rarely can get that kind of objective information, because even if we get like a hard number, it's still sort of meaningless. Like, I got a 500. Well, what does that mean? Like, 500 out of how much, and how many people have this score, and what is that like relative to other players or other people, and so forth. So when we lack objective information about our performance, what we like to do is make social comparisons, right? So we'll look at other people around us and we'll say, like, okay, I make more or less money than that person, or I have a better or worse job than that person, or I got a better score on the test than that person, or whatever it might be. And the interesting thing is that there's a lot of very predictable ways, and we have a lot of predictable biases about how we go about comparing ourselves to other people, and the sort of ways that we go about doing it, and what information we pay attention to, and to whom we decide to compare ourselves. For example, the related attribute hypothesis deals with the fact that we like to compare ourselves to people who are similar to us. And what's more, we like to compare ourselves to people who are similar to us on some attribute that's related to the task at hand. So if I want to know if I'm good at a game, I might want to compare myself to other people my age, if it's a Twitch-based kind of game. And I might not want to compare myself to, say, my 12-year-old daughter, who is sitting over here, because she has much better reflexes than I do these days. So, you know, I'll start seeking ways to sort of narrow down the comparison choices, so that, okay, people who are similar to me, people who are about my age, people who play Twitch games a lot, people who play this particular kind of game a lot. And so the more I'm able to sort of focus in on a particular person or set of people to compare myself to that are similar to me on tasks and attributes related to that, whatever it is I'm trying to compare myself on, you know, performance playing a game, for example, then I'm going to pay more attention to that comparison information. I'm going to take it more seriously, and I'm going to be more motivated to increase my own performance and practice and try to get better at it. Especially if I compare unfavorably. But I think that, no, if that person can do it, they're a lot like me, I should be able to do it. You start to form those hypotheses. And if there's not any sort of good comparison person, you know, to look at and compare ourselves against, then we sort of will not be more motivated and not really want to engage in that task as much. Which kind of brings me to the next psychological phenomenon. By the way, this is my favorite slide of the entire presentation. My wife begged me not to include it, but I just like it too much. I just like this little guy too much. This is called the frog pond effect. You may have heard of this called the big fish, little pond effect as well. It's also sometimes called the N effect, because N is, in psychology, refers to like the number of people in a group. But the basic idea is that people ranked near the top of a poor performing group feel better about their performance generally than do people ranked at the bottom of a high performing group. And I'll give you an example. I'll walk you through an example of here in just a second to kind of make that clear. But another way that I like to put it is that in order sometimes to feel like the smartest person in the room, all you have to do is step into a closet full of idiots. It has to do with the fact that we like to compare ourselves to people who are not only similar to us, but smaller groups of people. So we don't like to compare ourselves to the world or the universe of people at hand. So let me give you, that's especially true if those comparisons allow us to feel good about ourselves. So let me give you an example of a study, a 2010 study where a group of researchers brought subjects into a room at 10 at a time. So groups of 10 people, and they said, okay, we're going to split you into 2 groups of 5. So you 5 are on like the red team, and you 5 are on the blue team. I don't know if they actually use those colors, but you get the idea. 2 groups of 5, 10 people total, and they said, all right, we got a weird task for you guys. You're going to sit down and you're going to watch videotapes of people making statements into the camera. And your job is going to look at those statements and spot the liar. So some of these people are lying, some of them are not. And your job is going to be to look and see and tell who is lying in this situation. But as it turns out, the liars in the situation were the researchers themselves, as is most often the case, because what they actually ended up doing was giving people bogus feedback. So some people, they said, okay, you did this, and out of all 10 people in the room to come in and do this task, you were 5th out of 10 in terms of like your performance spotting the liar. And so those people were like, well, okay, 5th out of 10, that's not terrible. I could do better, but I guess that's okay. And they felt okay about themselves, and they gave them measures of like how sort of stressed out they were or disappointed and all these other sort of affective stuff. But for another groups that they ran through this same process, at the end they gave them bogus feedback, and they said, okay, you're 5th out of 10 out of all the people in the room, you're 5th, but you're 5th out of 5 on your team. So the idea, remember, they split them into 2 groups of 5 each. They said 5 out of 10 performance overall, but you were the worst person on your team. And these people got bummed out. And according to the measures they gave, they had lower sense of like self-efficacy, which is like a sense that I can do things if I try to. They were less motivated to continue doing similar tasks in the future, and they were generally just kind of sad. Same exact performance, 5th out of 10 in both situations. The only difference is that in one case it was framed as you were 5 out of 10 in a large group, and the other was you were 5 out of 10, but you're also 5th out of 5 on your team. So, it matters. A little sneak peek there. So it matters what size groups that we're in, and it matters sort of what comparison groups were even made available for us to compare ourselves to. If you go on a video game and you look at like leaderboards of performance, most people don't go straight to the global leaderboards, right, of all players in the world, because chances are like you're going to be way down the bottom, and it's not going to be interesting, and it's not going to give you any really good feedback about how well you're doing. Most people in situations like that would rather look at like their friends list. So of the 20, 30, 40, whatever people on my friends list, here's where I rank of the people who play this game. So sort of being able to focus on not global but more meaningful, smaller groups is much more motivating, and is going to get players to be much more engaged, going to get them to keep playing the game, keep trying to improve, keep trying to compete. And this sort of thing has been found out. The frog pond effect has been studied in a lot of different types of contexts, especially in education, in terms of like classroom size, where it can have a very big impact on academic performance. So I think it could be leveraged as well for how people are motivated to compete in video games. So this kind of takes me to the next phenomenon, which is what I call the Michaela is not impressed effect. There's probably a more scientific name for this, but I like this one because it kind of gets to the heart of it. Does anybody recognize this young woman? So this is Michaela Maroney, and Michaela Maroney is a better gymnast than you, me, anyone you know, or probably anyone that you could name using a Google search. So a few years ago at the Summer Olympics, I think the 2012, she helped her team on the U.S. Olympics win several gold medals in competition sports and in group sports. But she's kind of best known as the person who choked on one individual sport. She was making a run, I think it was like the pommel horse event, and she choked, and she ended up like falling down. And that mistake that she made ended up costing her the gold medal in that event. She got silver. And when she went up on the award stage, where they give the athletes the medals, she very briefly made this face. And the Michaela is not impressed meme kind of blew up on the internet, and jokers started like photoshopping her into like being unimpressed with all kinds of things, like I'm not impressed with the Eiffel Tower or an exquisitely tiny horse or whatever. And to her credit, Michaela kind of like leaned into it and owned like the meme. Like she had fun with it. And there's even like a famous picture of her with President Obama where they're both kind of making the face to the camera. But there's actually been some research to suggest that Maroney might have been happier, at least in that moment, she might have been happier winning the bronze medal instead of the silver. And in fact, while we're on the topic of the Olympics, there were some researchers at Cornell University who trained raters to look at the facial expressions of different Olympic medal winners it wasn't the 2012, I think it was like the one of the Olympics in the 1990s, but they trained them to like watch videotapes of the award ceremonies, and they rated like how often the person smiled and how happy they looked, and they calibrated, and so they got sort of consensus on how to make these ratings. And of course, they found out that the gold medal winners looked the happiest, right? For all the obvious reasons. They just won gold. They were in a class. It's a class of its own. It's a category of its own. They're the best of the best. But what was really interesting was the comparisons between the bronze and the silver medal winners, because the bronze medal winners tended to look happier than the silver medal winners, at least up there on the award stage. They smiled more. They sort of just had facial expressions conveying happiness more than the silver medal winners. And the researchers argued that this is because the silver medal winners are up there and they're making social comparisons with other people to kind of get an idea how well they did. And the silver medal winners are making upward social comparisons, right? They're looking at the gold medal winners and they're saying like, oh man, if I had just done a little bit better, if I had been like literally 100th or a 10th of a second faster, that could have been me up there. I could have been in a class of my own, could have been the best of the best. But the bronze medal winners were making downward social comparisons. Were they looking at the people who weren't medal winners at all, fourth place and beyond, and saying like, that was almost me. I wasn't able to get up here at all. And they tended to be much happier. So the Michaela is not impressed effect kind of highlights the fact that psychologically, not all rungs on a tournament ladder are equally spaced. There's a big psychological difference between first and second place, and it's bigger than the difference between any other 2 points except perhaps last place and second to last place, which people are also very, very sensitive to. People will do a lot to avoid being in last place if they can even just go up to second to last place. So there are some interesting things that game designers can do to sort of capitalize on this. You're going to have, best and second to best, but there are some other concepts. You might be able to break out scores and break out comparisons between groups and put people into smaller groups. I think the concept of par in golf might be instructive here, to where you can look and say like, okay, par on this hole or this part of the course is what you should shoot for. And if you make that, then that feels good. If you get lower, fewer shots than anybody else, that feels even better. But sort of giving some sort of, not arbitrary, but some sort of meaningful goal in there, in addition to these, first place or last place types of objectives, can be motivating. And you can break things out even more to look at like, well, okay, within your group, so like people who played with this loadout, or people who played with this kit, or people who used the sniper rifle, you were in the top 10%. So there's like different ways that you can sort of break down groups and group people differently that might have a very profound effect on how motivated they are to try again harder the next time and keep engaged with your game and keep playing. So some things to try. Facilitate comparisons to similar others, like I was saying. Find out who people want to compare themselves to. Find ways to cut the data so that players are near the top of smaller lists. I think you might have to walk a fine line on this, because people, if they feel like they're being manipulated or sort of tricked, then they may react poorly. There's also been a lot of research on things like the over-justification effect, where if people realize, or if they think that information is being presented to them in a way that's trying to like coerce or manipulate them, then it can backfire and they can actually be less motivated. So some caution and some experimentation might be in call there, but if you can find ways to make meaningful smaller cuts to the data, people should be more motivated to keep trying. And then, find the par for your game. Find the alternatives to the points and ranks that you can compare people against, and information, different types of information you can give them about their performance. So let's talk about use of social information. So Like with a lot of other products, gamers and people who buy games look to other people for sources of information about whether or not something's good or bad. And this is especially true for these very sort of subjective or squishy questions like, is this good? Is this fun? Those types of things. This is a screenshot, by the way, of Duke Nukem Forever reviews from Steam, in case you can't make that out. And the story of Duke is sort of interesting, and I'll get into it a little bit more in a couple of slides. But the idea here is that of social proof and social information is that something is normal to the extent that you see other people doing it. An opinion is normal to the extent that you see other people expressing it. Pretty well established phenomenon in social psychology and communication theory. And it all goes back, let's take a magical trip back to the 1950s again, to a series of classic experiments done by Solomon Asch, this researcher. And some of you are smiling and nodding because you may recognize this. But what Asch did was that he brought a group of people into a room, and he put up, this was the days before PowerPoint, so these were actually like big cardboard signs or things that he put up, and he would say, okay, you see the line on the left, and then I've got 3 lines over here on the right labeled A, B, and C. And we're going to go around the room, and I want each of you to tell me which of the lines on the right is the same same length as the one on the right. And so, the first person would say A. Go to the next person, they'd say A, and might go through a couple like that. But then somebody would then say C, and then the next person would say C. The next person would say C. And then the majority of the people in the room were all claiming that line C was the same length as the one on the left, which is clearly not true, right? Until it got down to the last person in the room, when he or she would look at that and they'd have to decide whether or not they were going to believe their eyes or whether they were going to say C, like everybody else was saying. And the trick to this experiment was that there was only one actual subject to the experiment, and it was always the last person whose turn it was to say which they thought was the correct line. And the idea was that if we had everybody else in the room claiming something, or almost everybody else in the room claiming something that was obviously not true, would it make the one true subject in the experiment believe that? And they found that in a very surprising number of cases, about 75% of the trials, under some circumstances they ran, the one true subject, the last person to give their opinion, said, yeah, see, that looks right to me. And the funny thing is, they would even go back to that person and like debrief them afterwards and say like, okay, here's the gig, here's like what we did, and so you understand, and so like, you want to change your answer? And some people actually refused to change their answer. They were like, no, it's C, it really is. And so they were disbelieving the proof that was there before their eyes and changing their perceptions of reality in order to match up with the social information that was being presented to them. So we can actually, so the idea is that the social information that we get from us in our environment can influence our perceptions of reality, and this is especially true when we're dealing with sort of squishy, like I said, ideas of like, is this good, or is this beautiful, or is this fun? And we actually don't have to rely on those classic line experiments, because people have actually done research to show that this is true in modern contexts. So one group of experimenters set up a music download like service for subjects to come in. And it was pretty similar to what you see on like iTunes or the Google Play Store or something like that, where people would come in and they sort of had 2 groups, and people in either group would come in, they would sit down at a computer, and they would have sort of a layout that said, here's all the different songs you can download and play, and there's also some information about star ratings. So they could give them like 1 to 5 star ratings, and they could also see how many times the song had been downloaded by other people. Just again, like you see a lot of times in things like iTunes, you see it in like games, like in Steam and so forth. And they found that if a song was sort of received an initial bump in like 5-star ratings or 4-star ratings, that would snowball, and that other people would use that information to determine that, yeah, this is a good song, this is a song I should download or give a high rating to. And so hits, songs became hits because they would break out early and those effects would kind of snowball. The interesting thing, though, is that that was one condition, or that was one group. The researchers also had a separate group where it was the same exact songs and the same setup where you would download and do whatever, but the information about the star ratings and the download counts was not available. People couldn't see that information. They didn't have it. And what the researchers found was that completely different songs turned out to be hits. So when you had access to the social information, certain songs that got that early bump and snowballed became hits, but when you didn't have it, it might be a totally different song that everybody started agreeing was a hit and was their favorite and was downloaded more or less. So that sort of early social information matters and it counts. Another research study actually did something similar with message board comments, where they went to a website that had like a karma, like a Reddit-style karma rating system for stories, you know, where readers could like upvote or downvote different stories and comments. And sort of they secretly seeded some of the stories with like a couple of upvotes, just automatically. They weren't actually made by anyone. They were just put in there by the system as part of this research. And they found that, yeah, like those early out of the gate upvotes meant that more of those types of stories made it to the front page or into the top 100. So they could manipulate like what people saw as popular and worth reading. In that case, there's some interesting caveats there about when people would be fooled and when not, but that was the general finding. So you can see this type of information about games show up, and in fact, you'll often see game publishers and developers trying to control the early spin on a game release, right? So they'll do things like not release review copies, they'll do things like ask reviewers to not release a review until the game has even been out in some cases, or give them embargoes on these types of things. And you see it show up in things like influencers, like on Twitch and YouTube, streamers and Let's Play people being asked to give positive spin to things, or giving negative spin, negative honest spin, and having that information affect future evaluations of the media. So some different things you can try. This one's kind of tricky. You know, you can try to manage early social information, but that could easily blow up on you, and or you could run into pesky ethics, you know, about trying to manipulate and lie and frame information in ways that's dishonest. You could find up ways to divvy up groups and sort of manage what information gets out to different groups. Or you could simply go with the flow and use that information and hope that early adoption of your game or whatever is positive. So let's talked about competition, and we talked about social information and other stuff. So let's talk finally about free-to-play pricing. Has anybody here ever played a free-to-play game? Anybody playing a free-to-play game right now? No, I mean like literally as you're sitting there right now. So you probably don't need me to tell you that free-to-play games are massively popular, that this business model has got a lot of huge success, and certain researchers have predicted that by like 2017, 95% of the games on like the Apple store and similar storefronts are going to be free-to-play. And this is opposed to like the premium model, for example, where you would pay like $5 or $9 or $10 and you just own the game outright. And there's not any of these sort of free-to-play microtransactions or in-app purchases that you have to deal with, because a lot of the free-to-play games then are free to start or free-to-play, but then they make money by like having you make in-app purchases. And I think some of the psychology around this is really interesting, and I think it's a fascinating question of like, why do people prefer this business model? I think why do people like free stuff is kind of a dumb question, right? That's not necessarily the question I'm trying to answer, but I think it's a much more interesting question to say like, well, why do people make that option when there are other options where they could pay like just a little bit more money? I mean, we're literally talking like a few dollars more, and then they wouldn't have any of those other mechanics, any of those other pain points that are designed into the free-to-play games in order to convert people. And by the way, there are a lot of free-to-play games that don't have those annoying features, a lot of them that are very successful without them. So I'm kind of framing this discussion in the context of the ones that are annoying and the ones that do like push and are designed in ways that people probably not prefer. So in order to answer this question, let's talk about chocolate. So there was a very interesting study done on Duke University campus where the researchers went out and they set up a booth like on some common area in the campus, probably like on the quad or along the path, and they said, hey, chocolate for sale. And you can buy one of two chocolates. You can either buy a regular old Hershey's Kiss, the little silver-wrapped Hershey's Kiss, or you can buy this like luxurious lunt, I think it's lunt, truffle, which is a very high quality, especially relative to Hershey's Kiss, high quality chocolate. Hershey's Kisses are fine. These truffles are really good though. And they said, you can buy one of these, but you can only buy one per student, one per person. And the price is you can spend 15 cents to buy the truffle, or you can spend 1 penny, 1 cent, to buy the Hershey's Kiss. So which do you think ended up being the more popular choice? Who thinks it was the Hershey's Kiss? Raise your hand. Who thinks it was the truffle? It was the truffle. About 69, 70% of the people preferred to spend just 15 cents on the Lindt truffle over just a penny for the Hershey's Kiss. And the reason the researchers hypothesize is that they expected more, they call it utility, but they expected more pleasure out of the truffle than the Kiss, and it was like the ratio of cost to pleasure was more favorable for the truffle than it was for the Hershey's Kiss. So like I expected that ratio of pain to pleasure, pain coming from spending a little bit of money to pleasure from eating the chocolate, to be better for me in the case of the truffle. But then the researchers did, as they often do, something interesting. The next day they came out and they set up their little platform, their little table again, and they said chocolate for sale, but they dropped the price of each one of the options by a penny. So now you could buy the truffle for 14 cents, or you could buy the Hershey's Kiss for 0 cents, for free. Now who thinks it was the Hershey's Kiss that was the more popular choice? It absolutely was. People's preference flipped, and about 69 to 70% of the people preferred the free Hershey's Kiss over the 14-cent truffle. Rationally speaking, completely logically speaking, this doesn't make any sense because the price of each one of those chocolates dropped by the same amount, and so the ratio of pain to pleasure, cost to pleasure, is unchanged from the previous example where they were 15 cents and a penny each. Totally the same ratio of cost to pleasure, or expected pleasure. But there's something about that, something psychological happening when you start talking about free as a price point. They also did another series of similar experiments with Amazon.com gift cards. So they started off by saying, okay, you can get either a $10 or $20 Amazon card. And you can buy a $10 card for $1, pretty good deal, or you can buy a $20 gift card for $8. So who would go for the $10 for $1? And who would go for the $20 for $8? And probably the reason is that the $20, spending $8 to get a $20 card nets you $12 in credit, right? Whereas spending $1 on a $10 only nets you $9 in credit. Amazon.com is, you can find something there you want. Like this is a pretty fungible, as the economists like to say, gift card. Like it's almost as good as cash. And it's exactly what they found. Most people went for the $20 card for $8. Of course, you can probably guess, by this point, when they dropped the price of each one of the options by $1, people's preferences flipped. Most people went for the free $10 card instead of spending $7 to get the $20 card, even though they got $10 worth of credit in one case and $13 worth of credit in the other case. It's all about the fact that free triggers some psychological processes, and we react to it very differently. And some of the reasons that the researchers came up with is that, there's a couple of main ones that they address. One, free makes us it's a sure thing, right? And we are just sort of wired, or we have evolved to the point where we are very biased in terms of biased towards free options that are risk-free options, even relative to like very low risk options. So even if something is a very small risk, like spending 14 cents on a truffle, and whether or not we might like it or not, we're much more biased to go for the no-risk option, which would be the free Hershey's Kiss, because there's like no chance that you're not going to get your money's worth out of a free chocolate or a free $10 gift card. The other thing they suggest might be a possibility is that free makes us feel good, right? Free makes us happy. And when that happens, it just makes us feel good, makes us feel happy to get something for free, a gift. And when that happens, there's something called the affect heuristic that comes into play, which is where our brains substitute the easy question of, does this make me happy, for the more difficult question of, is this a good deal, or is this the better option? So sort of figuring out, like doing the math and saying like, well, my subjective utility, expected utility for this option is such and such, but for this option it's that. It's just like, well, okay, which one makes me happy? And that's the better one. And most of the time, that's not a bad strategy for making decisions, but it is fairly predictable, and it can lead to weird outcomes like this. So related to this, let me tell you a little story about a mobile game. Anybody heard of a game called Smarter Than You? A couple of people. Anybody ever heard of 10 Million or You Must Build a Boat? Mobile games. So between 10 Million and You Must Build a Boat, the guy that made those games made this little game called Smarter Than You, and it's a little dueling game. It's like rock, paper, scissors, except that it's like arrow, sword, counter, or something weird like that. But you would open the game, and it would matchmake you with somebody else out there in the world, and you would play this little rock, paper, scissors games. And the interesting thing is that at the end of like a round, and back up a sec, there's also like a cosmetic and experience point system in it, where you win matches, you gain experience points, and then you can use those experience points to like get a little hat for your dude, or change your background, or change your icon, or whatever. And people like that kind of stuff, because of course they do. So the interesting thing, though, was in Smarter Than You, that at the end of a round, you had the option of tipping your opponent with bonus experience points. So you could say, good game, here's 200 or whatever, here's 200 experience points, and then they could take those experience points, and they had value because they could buy the cosmetic stuff with them. But the trick was that in order to do that, you had to make an in-app purchase. So you might have to pay like $1 or $2 to give that person a tip, and you got nothing out of it except spending $1 or $2. And so the game developer was interested in like, he called it like an experiment in altruism, like what would people do if they had the option to do this? Perhaps not surprisingly, like nobody tipped. Nobody went for it. It was a complete failure. He told me that out of like the millions of games played, what did he say? It was like a couple thousand people tipped, which you do the math and you round off, that's 0%, right? So nobody tipped. It's a total failure. So he did something interesting. In an update to the game, he added the option of watching an ad and then tipping your opponent. So watching an advertisement is kind of a common monetization technique in free-to-play games, right? So you watch this 30-second commercial and you get 10 gold coins or some experience points or whatever in the game, things that you might otherwise spend real money on through an in-app purchase. So when the developer put this option to watch ads in and then tip, or you could say like, no, I don't want to watch the ad, take me to the next game, or I'm closing out or whatever, and you would just go on your way. But when you put this option in, the percentage of people that tipped went from 0 to 60%. So all of a sudden, of the people who had this option to tip by watching a video in a way that didn't cost them anything, about 60% of them took the opportunity to tip somebody else. A much larger increase you would expect from math alone. But they did it because it was a free option to tip somebody else. So give that sort of thing. So some things that you can try around the psychology of free-to-play marketing, free-to-play pricing, experiment with free and non-pay options, kind of like the Smarter Than You game. Find different ways to like contrast things, or be careful about how you contrast things, especially free options, and be careful about putting them like in the same list or the same set of options as paid. experiment with like different ways of presenting those things to players and to see if one presentation increases the number of in-app purchases versus taking free options and so forth. So those are my ideas. If any of you experiment with them, I'd love to know how it goes. If you try any of this type of stuff, you can reach me at psychologyofgames.com. And there's links, all kinds of links there on how to find me on various social media or send me an email, which you can also do at jamie@psychologyofgames.com. And I'm at Jamie Madigan on Twitter. So that's what I got. Thanks for coming out.